Hello interwebs, welcome to Let's Fix Computers. I've got an Acer Predator laptop here. This is a Predator Triton 300, apparently, model N20C3. And apparently it doesn't turn on. Apparently the charger cuts out when you plug it in. However, there's no light on the charger itself, so I'm not sure what's going on. We've got some indicator LEDs here, so let's just see if those do anything when I plug it in. Here we go. No, stone dead. Okay. So we don't know if the charger cut out or not because the charger itself doesn't have an indicator light, but apparently there's no life at all in the laptop. So let's take the back cover off of this and see if we can see what's going on. Stone dead no power is generally a good sign in my opinion, because that often means you have a fairly fundamental problem with the laptop. So, ironically, the most catastrophic looking problems are often the most approachable ones. Whereas when you have like standby power but nothing happens when you push the power button, that's when you're going to have a harder time with it, because at that point you probably have standby power and main rail power, but you've got some missing logic signal somewhere where one of the many little logic signals in the laptop is or sensors is not there, and thus the laptop is not ready to turn on. And those ones tend to be nightmares to figure out. So let's get the back cover off of this and do some quick stabbing and see if we can spot something obvious. This being a gaming laptop, of course, there's always a danger of just high side short and a dead CPU, which is why we don't like gaming laptops. Okay, let's disconnect the battery. I should note that this was in with another repair shop, and they reckoned it had a short on the motherboard, which they were unable to deal with, so they then redirected the customer to me. Thank you very much, folks. If they're watching and they recognize this laptop, appreciate the forward, the referral. That's the word I'm looking for. Anyway, right, let's turn on the multimeter. I'll put it into resistance mode. And we're going to put a black probe on a ground point. So, have we got a nice big capacitor? That'll do. So we can stab any screw hole, but I've started stabbing the back of a large-ish capacitor. I'll give you a close-up of this in a minute. Because if you go onto the back of a large-ish capacitor, you've got a nice big solder blob that your probes will... jumping camera again. Sorry, folks. I will sort it at some point. Anyway, if you go onto the back of a large-ish capacitor, you've got a nice solder blob that the probe will actually sink into and stab into. Whereas on just simply a screw hole, you've just got hard metal, and it's harder to get a good connection there. So I've started stabbing the back of a large capacitor for my ground points. So we've got some big electrolytic capacitors here next to the CPU. So these are going to be on the main power rail because they're 25 volt capacitors. They've got 25 written on top. Again, I'll give you a close-up of this in a minute. Let's check that. Uh-oh. 1.5 ohms. That's bad. We're looking for 0 ohms. We're looking for less than 1 ohms. 1.5 ohms, that smells of a high side short to me, because that low resistance but not a dead short, that's the kind of resistance you see through silicon. So that's the kind of resistance you see if one of the MOSFETs has shorted and you're seeing a path through the CPU, through the GPU, or something like that, or through video memory, that kind of thing. So, we've got some more electrolytics over here. I'm going to quickly pick a completely different place now. I'm going to go onto a screw hole and these ones over here. Let's see if we get something else. Slightly more. Again, 1.5. Uh-oh, spaghetti-o. Let's roll the intro. I'm going to take the heatsink off and we're going to do some closer inspections. I think I think this one's going to be a bust, but I'm going to keep going, and if this is if the video is 10 minutes long, then it probably means that this is going to be an autopsy, and I'm simply going to show you how to identify a high side short. So yeah, see you after the intro, folks. Okay, so now we've got the heatsink off and we can see everything a bit more clearly. I'll redo those measurements that I just did and just show you how I've determined the information we currently have. So firstly, we want to measure the main power rail, and the quickest and easiest way to find the main power rail is to go to a place where it's going to be used, which is the CPU power. So the CPU is always going to be powered off of the main power rail. So we've got the CPU, and then directly next to that, we've got power area. So if we have a look here, you can see we've got a stack of inductors, there's some capacitors, and we've got MOSFETs. Or in this case, these are probably some kind of basic power stages, but whatever, it doesn't matter. Power chips. So these are going to be taking power from the main power rail at about 19.5 volts or battery voltage, and stepping it down to CPU voltage. And so next to those, we've got some electrolytic capacitors. Now, most modern laptops don't run electrolytics, but Acer were fairly late to ditching these, so they're still there. But at any rate, any big capacitors you have directly next to these power stages are going to be input capacitors. So let's take a closer look at this under the microscope, and I can show you those measurements. So here's our CPU core, and if we start moving backwards, you can see we've got this fat trace here that comes back to the CPU V-core bypass capacitors. So these are large capacitors, but they are low voltage, high capacitance. So those will be 330 microfarad, 2-volt capacitors, something like that. Doesn't matter exactly what, but low voltage, high capacitance. Then moving back, you can see they all go into this bank of inductors. And then moving back, you can see that each inductor goes onto one of these power stages, which is covered in some thermal goop. This one's got a mark on it, and I'm curious as to if that means anything. No, I don't think so. I think that's just a mark, just where the thermal gunk wasn't completely even. Anyway, so each one of these will have a ground connection and a positive connection. And then here's those electrolytic capacitors, which, as you can see, have got a positive side here and a negative side over here. And these are 25-volt capacitors. So the main power rail will be rated for, up to 19.5 volts, and capacitors, the voltage rating of a capacitor, that is the highest voltage that it will tolerate. So this doesn't mean that these things deliver 25 volts, it means you can charge them up to 25 volts. But on the main power rail, these will be charged up to about 19.5. So we've got a ground connection on this side, and we've got a positive connection on this side. And if I turn the multimeter back on, we're seeing 1.38 ohms there. Now, again, on the main power rail, we're expecting to see, mega ohms, hundreds of thousands to mega ohms. And what we want, if we were trying to fix if we had a fixable fault here, we would expect to see less than 1 ohm. So we'd expect to see functionally 0, except for just resistance in the probing and stuff like that. Okay, so where do we think that 1.5 ohms might be coming from? Well, it could be the CPU. I think that's too low to be the CPU. I'd expect the CPU to be more like, between 3 and 10 ohms, something like that. So let's check that. So let's go, we can check these capacitors here. So we've got a positive connection here and a ground here. So let's put my black probe on this ground and red probe on the positive. Well, womp womp, there you go. It's the same. Now, we should be seeing a different result here because the main power rail gets stepped down through these power stages, so there should not be a direct connection from the main power rail to CPU vCore. These things should be acting as a barrier, so we should be seeing a different resistance on the other side of the power stages and inductors. But because we're seeing the same resistance, that means there is a direct path through these power stages somewhere. So one of these power stages has gone bang. So we'll have a look at a bit closer at one of those in just a sec. But another test that I'm going to do, just for demonstration, is I'm going to move over to here. Here is our GPU, big slab of silicon with thermal paste on it. You can just see the NVIDIA logo there. And if we move up, here is the power section for the GPU. So again, we've got capacitors, inductors, power stages, or these are more likely to be DR MOSFETs, and I'll explain what that is in a moment, but it doesn't matter. I'm going to call them power stages for simplicity because that's a generic term for just a power conversion device. Again, we'll get to that in a sec. So once again, have we got any input? Yeah, here's some input capacitance up here. So once again, if we measure up here, we'll go negative to positive, and we're seeing 1.53-ish. You'll notice that the resistance is slightly higher. That's because we're slightly further away from the short, and you could narrow down the location of the short through just looking for the lowest possible resistance, but you're going to need a pretty good multimeter to do that, and I've got a mid-range multimeter here, so whatever. Anyway, so once again, if we move down past these power stages to these capacitors, so these capacitors are on the other side of those power stages. They should be blocked off. So again, if I check these guys here, let's see what we get. And now we're seeing 0.3 ohms. Now, you might look at that. Oops, I've just fallen off it. Let's try and get a better read again. There we go. Now, you might look at that and go, well, that's a dead short circuit. And you'd be right. That's functionally 0 ohms. However, GPUs are like this. GPUs have functionally 0 internal resistance. That's just how they are. But we don't really care about that because the important thing is that this resistance is different to what we're seeing on the main power rail. That's the important thing. It's different. So that means we do not have the low resistance on the main power rail going through these power stages. So that tells us that this is all fine. Unlike what we saw over here on the CPU, where we saw exactly the same resistance on both sides of these power stages. So let's have a look at what these are and understand what they're doing. I'll just wipe the thermal gunk off of them just so we can take a closer look. So that's a GA011S. It might be a 6962, but I think the GA0011S, I think that's the part number that we actually care about. Let's look that up and see what it is. Okay, right, Google searching that chip number didn't really get me anywhere. So I Google searched the board number, which is LAJ891P, which led me to bad caps, which led me to these chaps. Shout out the bad caps people for finding schematics. Love you guys. So now we have a schematic where I searched for PQZ3, which is one of the chips we've got here. And that gives me this part number, which is that. So I then Google searched that, which led me to the data sheet. And that tells us this is an alpha and omega semiconductor. There's the correct logo. It's that GA logo. And this is a 30-volt dual asymmetric N-channel MOSFET. So what is a 30-volt dual asymmetric N-channel MOSFET? Well, first of all, here is a very brief rundown of what these VRMs are doing. For a buck regulator, you need two MOSFETs, a high side and a low side. And these switch back and forth with the high side turning on, then the low side turning on, and back and forth. And for each time the high side turns on, it lets through a pulse of high voltage which charges the inductor. And when the high side switch is off and the low side switch is on, you can now source current from ground through that inductor and out into the circuit. So the stored energy in the inductor then has a place to go. So the irony is the power actually comes from the low side, which is why low side MOSFETs are often higher built in a VRM. But we're getting into complicated electron flow stuff, which is on the edge of my knowledge, so we'll leave it at that. The point is, you've got two MOSFETs, they turn on and off one after the other, and you charge the inductor, and then the inductor outputs into the circuit. And the inductor smooths, and the capacitors further smooth. So we need two MOSFETs, and there's a couple of ways that these can be packaged up. You can have VRMs where you have two separate MOSFETs, a high side and a low side. You can have a dual MOSFET package, which is what we're looking at here. You can have a DR MOSFET, which is where you have dual MOSFETs with an integrated driver to drive the gates. Or finally, you can go into smart power stages where you have dual MOSFETs, driver, and smart monitoring, where you actually have a data connection to the chip for monitoring current flow, temperature, and that kind of thing. So these dual MOSFET packages have two internal MOSFETs, as you can see in the diagram here. And somewhere else nearby on the board, there will be a driver chip which is driving the gates on these MOSFETs. And one of these will be the high side and the other will be the low side. So we can check which one of these is the high side and low side by going back to the schematic, which I conveniently have to hand. So you can see here, if we have a look at that schematic, that we have, so there's our driver chip that is driving the gates. Then we have our main power comes in here. We've got 19 volts here coming into D1. So 19 volts comes into the drain. So power drains into the MOSFET. Then we are sourcing from ground. So our source pins connect down to ground. And then in the middle, we've got the drain of the low side and the source of the high side outputting on pin 7. And that goes out through to our VCC core. And so D1 is our input. So on the data sheet, we've got D1. So that's these three pins. So that's our high side input. Then the source of Q1 and the drain of Q2 are connected together onto this big fat pad in the middle. So this is where the output goes to. And then finally, we've got the source of our low side that connects down to ground. So what's the failure mode of this going to look like? Well, remember what we're seeing. We're seeing the same resistance at our output as we are at our input. So D1 to S1D2. So what we're seeing here is that Q1 has failed short and power is flowing directly from D1 straight through this MOSFET. Now you can see from the internal body diode of this MOSFET, can I zoom in further? Yes. Now you can see from the body diode of this MOSFET that power should not be able to flow directly through here. That's why we shouldn't be seeing that the same resistance. So power is thrown straight through here and it's hitting the output and going straight through into the CPU. So effectively, when we connect the charger, we're sending 19 volts from the main power rail directly into the CPU. So what this means is that the CPU is dead, or like probably dead. The laptop will detect this fault condition and it will cut the power almost instantaneously. But it probably did not cut the power before 19 volts went into the CPU and exploded it. The chances of the CPU surviving this are slim to nil. They're low enough that I'm not going to bother attempting to replace this and fix the laptop, because I'll have to find another MOSFET and then replace it, and it's not going to work. The chances of success here are very, very low. If you care, you can try. I'm not going to. So that is what has happened here. So let's go back to the board and let's see if we can identify which one has failed, and I can show you that short circuit through whichever one of these has failed. Now, while most of these are connected in parallel, not all of them are. This guy over here looks extremely sketchy. However, I don't think that's a V-core MOSFET. I think this is for an auxiliary rail, and we'll just quickly check the output of that to see. So let's go over to, let's see, so that is, we've got our input coming to here, goes across to here, so that's going to be a ground, so let's just check that guy. Yeah, and we've got 10 ohms there. So this is not on the same circuit as the others. That's on an auxiliary rail because there are multiple voltage rails going into the CPU. So we don't care about this guy. It looks sketchy, but that one's fine. So do any of those guys look like our failure point? I'm going to stare real close at those. We're looking for one that maybe has a solder ball sticking out where it's overheated or something like that, but I'm not seeing any big giveaways here. Well, we could just start lifting them. Alternatively, I could guess that the one over here that had that little mark in the thermal goop is the guy at fault. I'm going to do that. So I'm just going to quickly blast this with hot air and lift it off the board and see if I get lucky. Right, there's still a lot of heat in the board, but let's just see if our short circuit has disappeared. So we'll go back to these caps. Nope, curiously we've gone down to a dead short now. Sorry, Mr. Capacitor, to the lower left. This is an autopsy now. Check our status. And our survey says... Oh my days, we're still shorted. Okay. Door number 3. It's one of them. It's one of them. There we go. Alright, we got our culprit. Cooling down. Alright, so with PQZ2 removed, now when I check our main rail capacitor, you can see that we're no longer shorted. We've now got kilo ohms of resistance, and if I just check that again, that's jumped up to mega ohms of resistance. So we're no longer shorted. And now what will happen is if I check from ground to V-core, you can see that over here we've still got our low resistance. Interestingly, it's 0.6 now, but like this thing is probably the whole setup is now in a poor state, so it doesn't matter. But the point is, we have removed the connection between the main rail and V-core, so it was going through this guy. So if I put the if I bring this guy back into shot, so let's flip this dude over. Whoop. So let's put this guy in position upside down. So we had main power was coming in here. It's coming in through D1. It goes through the high side MOSFET and it comes out on this pad, which then goes up into the inductors. And then the low side MOSFET is connecting from this pad to the source of the low side MOSFET on this side. So what we're going to find is we have a direct short from our drain to our source here. So I'll just put my multimeter probes across these two pads. And as you can see, we have 0 ohms of resistance. That's 0.07, so that's a dead short. That is nothing. So that is our failed high side MOSFET. So this is our high side short into the CPU. And that's basically game over for this laptop. So at this point, the chances of the CPU being okay are functionally zero, especially because even now we're seeing less than 1 ohm of resistance in the CPU, and a healthy CPU we expect to see a couple of ohms of resistance. So this is also a pretty strong indicator that the CPU is dead. If you're absolutely bonkers, you can do CPU replacements on these, but that's not a service that I provide. So I will put on the other 2 MOSFETs. I'll leave this one off because it's shorted. We'll put these guys back on just so I can restore the board as much to as it was when I found it. And that's the end of this. It's powered on. So the laptop has powered on because we've cleared the electrical fault. But it ain't gonna post because the CPU is dead. Also, yeah, the keyboard's a wreck on this thing. The customer did actually bring in a replacement keyboard for it. And I was going to replace that if I got it working. I'm just using a Chipmunk here. This is the CMI Zapper Chipmunk. If the green USB LED flashes, that means there's activity on the USB, on the Universal Serial Bus. And if there's activity on the USB ports, that means that the PCH is doing something, which means that the CPU is probably doing something. So that's how we know if there's possibly anyone at home. No, it's brain dead. We're done here. The CPU is dead. The lights are on, but no one's home. So, yeah. So it's kicking, it's making noises. But yeah, there's no one at home. That CPU is dead. So there we go, folks. A predictable result that we kind of saw coming before I even rolled the intro. But I hope that that autopsy in analysing what had gone wrong can help you recognise that if you see that when you're looking at laptops. Because I have shown plenty of examples where it wasn't a high side short, but it's not very often that we actually go into what the high side short looks like. So now hopefully you're a bit better equipped to recognise it when you see it. And as you saw from the beginning, you can see it coming a mile away. If you see that low resistance on your main rail, by all means, go in and check. But yeah, as soon as you see a high side short, pretty much game over. Thanks, folks. See you next time. Bye.